on today's episode of the Law of Tech podcast?
I mean, I think that the problem is without tech abuse kind of being understood as such a big part of, domestic abuse in 2021, I think that sometimes people will be experiencing it without even realizing that they're experiencing it. And I think if they don't, fully understand what tech abuse is, then I think sometimes people might feel like, oh, it's fine. Like, it's normal that they're doing this. It's normal that they're doing that, even if really it is a form of coercion and control. I think the burden really is upon the victim to kind of provide this proof. And certainly those types of things, how do you provide it?
Hi and welcome to another episode of the Law of Tech podcast. In this episode, we'll be exploring the legal implications of emerging technologies on domestic violence and abuse, and for this I'm joined by Francesca Stevens. Francesca received her degree in Criminology and Criminal Justice from City University of London and recently completed a year of interdisciplinary research at the University of Kent. Here she explored cyber abuse and adult victimization with a focus on online stalking and harassment. Her interests include the criminal justice system, cyber victimization, mental health, and gender equality, and she's currently also a research assistant on the IoT project at University College, London. Francesca, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here with you today.
Now, before we delve deeper into the topic of today's episode, I was interested to hear from you what exactly the IoT project is, and also what led you to join this project.
Sure. So to give us a little bit of background on myself, I actually used to work in the event industry for 5 years after I graduated from UCL in 2013 with a degree in anthropology. Sort of just fell into events, but then I've always been really fascinated by criminology and criminal justice. So decided in 2018 to go back and do a master's in this. And I just absolutely fell in love with the subject and realized that was really what I wanted to do. And my degree culminated in a dissertation which examined female victimization, specifically in relation to sexual harassment in the workplace, and explored social movements such as Me Too and Time's Up, which had sort of just come out around that time, and looking at whether or not these had impacted if women were less likely to speak up against these kind of crimes in the workplace. So this really sort of fueled my interest in victimization and also cyber abuse and technology over this year. And then, as you mentioned, I went on to do a year of research at the University of Kent, which concluded in a paper that was published in a cyber psychology journal, which explored cyber abuse and mental health for adult victims and survivors. And it was actually in this year where I had the pleasure of meeting Leonie Tanczer. So she's a lecturer at UCL in International Security and Emerging Technologies. And basically we met at an event and then we stayed in touch, and I attended a talk that she did about her Gender and IoT project, which is an interdisciplinary project at UCL, where she explores with her team the implications of Internet of Things devices on gender-based domestic abuse and violence. And then I was thrilled when last November she asked me to get involved as a research assistant in the team.
That is really, really great. And I can imagine that it's not only an interesting topic to research, but of course also a very important one to look into. Now, in terms of the research that you are focusing on, what is your main focus within the IoT project?
So the research that we've been doing since I've joined Gender and Internet of Things is basically been focusing on the applicability of the Computer Misuse Act 1990 and to analyse its relevance for technology-facilitated abuse. So to give a bit of background, the Computer Misuse Act has traditionally been associated with unauthorised access to computer material for generally financial and monetary gain. However, the Act may also be used to prosecute intimate partner violence tech abuse offenders, although we found that this is rarely the case. And in the UK, the Computer Misuse Act for over 40 years has been the main instrument to prosecute perpetrators of computer-related crime. And historically, these technologically enabled forms of abuse have been associated with business and commercial interests, yet we see the applicability of the Computer Misuse Act to domestic abuse, IPV and stalking cases as becoming more important and more as more devices are connected to the internet. And exploring the applicability of the Computer Misuse Act has actually been something that Leonie, who's the principal investigator of this project, has wanted to do for a while. And late last year in 2020, the UK Home Office announced that there's a domestic abuse perpetrators research fund, which they had established basically to support research to further the understanding of the perpetrators of domestic abuse and really strengthen the evidence base of what works in addressing this behaviour. So we were very lucky to be one of the number of projects that was successfully awarded funding. And our project is one of the first of its kind to explore the relevance of the Act for cases of domestic abuse. And there's a research report from 2015, which is one of the few existing studies into the Computer Misuse Act. And it demonstrated that a limited number of perpetrators had previously been convicted of domestic abuse. So what we wanted to do was basically examine and analyse court cases in England and Wales where the Computer Misuse Act was relevant. So we extracted cases from three online legal databases and then systematically analysed the features of these cases. So, for example, this included looking at the extent and the nature of domestic abuse and intimate partner violent cases within Computer Misuse Act offences, as well as identifying how the use of technology in domestic violence and intimate partner violence cases has evolved over time.
That is really interesting, and I definitely want to delve deeper into some of the findings that you came to and also some of the results that you obtained through this project. But to really kick off this episode, maybe it's a good idea to paint a bit of a background on the topic that we're talking about, to paint some background on the topic of technology-facilitated abuse. Now, of course, domestic and sexual abuse are nothing new to this day and age, yet technology has enabled perpetrators of such abuse to take their acts of harassment and violence to new and unprecedented levels. Now, a term that is often referred to within this context is tech abuse. Maybe a good point to start this episode is by defining this concept of tech abuse. And I'm also interested to know what this concept of tech abuse entails.
So I think tech abuse can basically be described as sort of the subversion of everyday digital technological systems. So this would include computers, smartphones, apps, cameras. So it's basically when these sort of systems are really used to kind of coerce, control and harm an individual. So this can include offences such as image-based abuse, which is colloquially known as revenge porn. So this can be understood as the sharing of private sexual materials, for example, a photo or a video of someone else, when this is shared without their consent, with basically the purpose to embarrass or distress this victim. It could be cyber stalking. It could be GPS tracking, so whether this is installing spyware on someone's mobile phone or even a tracker on their car to kind of keep track of their movements. And so these sorts of abuses, really expose victims and, often their family members, their children, to all types of physical, emotional and financial harms as well. And I was just going to say that, sadly, it's been estimated recently in research that nearly 85% of victims of domestic abuse are actually subjected to some form of tech abuse. However, sadly, at the moment, tech abuse crimes are often not considered to be domestic abuse offences when people sort of traditionally think about what that term means.
Now, speaking about this quantitative picture, one of the causes that has really led to a spike in the number of tech abuse cases has been the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I'm interested to know from you, to what extent have you seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has really contributed to the rise in the amount of tech abuse cases?
So at the moment, the research that we've been doing hasn't specifically kind of looked at that element of COVID-19 and the pandemic. But I think, generally, there's no doubt about the fact that all of our lives, have obviously transformed through the pandemic and lockdown, and how, our lives are now more online than ever, whether it's school, work, socializing. And sadly, perpetrators have certainly taken advantage of this and, have used technology as a tool to continue to kind of control and coerce victims. And so it's more sort of the charities such as like Women's Aid and Refuge, which have been, they receive a lot of calls from victims kind of seeking help. They're sort of reporting this increase on tech abuse that they're seeing.
I think that, of course, all of this all indicates that increasingly technology has really become a tool for abuse, and survivors often report being stalked, for example, through tracking apps on their phones. And I think this is also something we'll be getting to perhaps a little later. Perhaps you've got a couple of cases that you came across in the analysis of the Computer Misuse Act within this context. Now, so basically, survivors often report being stalked through, for example, tracking apps on their phone, keyloggers on their computers, or they also indicate that their lives are being controlled through smart devices in their homes. And such abuse is generally termed tech abuse. Now, when talking about tech abuse, reference can also be made to both conventional but also less conventional technologies, and we often refer to these as the Internet of Things technologies. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about what Internet of Things technologies are and what they refer to within the context of tech abuse?
Sure. So I think, IoT devices can sort of simply be defined as smart interconnected devices. And examples of such include smart speakers. So, for example, the Amazon Echo, which can be controlled through voice activation, smart locks that can be opened with an app, smart heating systems, which can allow for control from afar. So these types of devices, really provide abusers with opportunities to control, harass, and stalk their victims. An example could be you could be in a relationship with someone who, spent time at your home, and you had smart applications in your home, such as, you had smart heating. So they had the app on their phone, which also allowed them to control it because they were there, and, they also wanted to kind of, you would ask them to turn up the heating or whatever. But so that relationship ends, and let's say the man who wasn't living there has, he sort of becomes abusive, and part of his abuse and his kind of wish to control could be that from afar, he is still trying to change the heating. So it may sound small and it may not sound as serious as, some other forms of abuse, but if you kind of think about how that victim will feel in her own home, how she has no control over the temperature in her own home. Is the heating super high in summer and is she freezing in winter? The fact that someone is controlling you, what else could they be controlling? And then it's about how do you get them off the system, and those kind of things. I think it's so easy to buy an IoT device and think kind of all the great positives that come with it and kind of the ease it allows you. But whether or not then the vendors selling these products, are they equipped to then help when these situations turn bad? Sadly, that's not really the case.
And in terms of reporting such forms of abuse, are victims of tech abuse generally willing to report their experiences?
I think that the problem is without tech abuse kind of being understood as such a big part of, domestic abuse in 2021, I think that sometimes people will be experiencing it without even realizing that they're experiencing it. And I think if they don't, fully understand what tech abuse is, then I think sometimes people might feel like, oh, it's fine. It's normal that they're doing this. It's normal that they're doing that, even if really it is a form of coercion and control. I think the burden really is upon the victim to kind of provide this proof. And certainly those types of things, how do you provide it? And I think, one of the things on the government website is gaslighting. And I think where that comes into play here is certainly there is an element of gaslighting control. So say the example I used before, a woman could say, this man won't stop controlling my heating and etc. How can she prove that? And then is she going to be told that she's crazy? Is she going to be told she's imagining it? And certainly, the police aren't necessarily always trained to understand different types of abuse, particularly when tech is changing all of the time. How can we expect them without adequate training to kind of understand all of these nuances? So I think there's so many different elements that are so complicated in this field, and you can see how there's just so many roots that kind of need to all be improved in order for this experience to kind of get better.
That is a really good point that you made, and I also think that, of course, these considerations should be taken into consideration, but also should be taken really, really seriously when thinking about the different measures that we should be taking in order to combat tech abuse, and also to take the victims of such abuse seriously, and allowing support services to be sufficiently equipped to actually act upon the finding of such abuse. Now kind of linking to this point that you made, and looking at the GIoT project, I think it's nice to maybe look at the various findings that the team at UCL uncovered throughout the research project up until now. So basically these findings include, firstly, the support services face shortcomings in existing tech abuse provisions. There is a lack of awareness and technical capacity in support services to deal with IoT facilitated tech abuse. Tech abuse must be considered in policies and legislation. Tech abuse is not considered in risk assessments and safety plans, and there is currently a lack of data on tech abuse. Now, looking at these findings, I think that for the purposes of this episode, it would be interesting to delve a little bit deeper into the legal implications and framing. Now, looking at this topic more broadly, what is the legal framework that we're really looking at when we're talking about tech abuse more generally? And I think we can look at this from a UK perspective, as that is, of course, your main focus.
So I think the thing with tech abuse is, there's not one piece of legislation where it comes under. So it falls under a range, including domestic abuse legislation, stalking and harassment legislation, image-based abuse legislation, upskirting legislation, and then obviously, as we've touched upon in our recent research, the fact that some tech abuse offences can actually fall within the Computer Misuse Act, although the legislation is rarely used within such cases. I think it's, what maybe isn't always kind of well known just by, someone who kind of doesn't work in this field is, despite the fact that cybercrime, cyber abuse is such a widespread problem, and, certainly something, we're always reading about in the media, and, it's not kind of a secret problem, we don't actually have legislation that's been created to tackle cyber abuse, but instead these crimes fall beneath pre-existing legislation. So I think, it's tricky because, for example, cyber abuse could fall beneath the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. It could fall beneath Domestic Violence Crime and Victims Act 2004. It could fall under the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012 or the Malicious Communications Act 1998. There's so much to understand when you're not a lawyer, and even then, who says that every lawyer would necessarily know exactly which type of cyber abuse would fall under which legislation. Like, it's very complicated. And there has been quite a lot of focus recently in the UK actually regarding the Online Safety Bill, which was formerly known as the Online Harms White Paper. And basically, in this bill, the government have been seeking to establish a new framework to tackle harmful content online. But there have been various concerns with it. So, for example, one of these was that people felt it would not adequately protect children from online pornography. And another one is that some peers have asked the government to clarify if the bill's definition of psychological impact has any clinical basis. So these are just two examples of sort of issues that people have taken with the bill. So it will be interesting to see kind of, I think, how this develops over time and sort of what frameworks are introduced, because it certainly has been, I think, a hot topic recently. What's interesting, and I guess as well super relevant here, is another bill called the Domestic Abuse Bill, which has received royal assent this year. And I think a lot of people in the community sort of who research in this area, work in this area really tirelessly for kind of victims' rights, feel it certainly was a big step in the right direction. But then, for example, there are still significant gaps. So I know that the GIoT team had really hoped to have seen a better account of risk deriving from emerging technologies like IoT within the bill. So whilst it is good that tech is being accounted for in legislation such as domestic abuse, stalking and harassment, I think we're often seeing that legislators are a bit too narrow in their understanding and conceptualization of tech. So while they still consider tech mainly as smartphones and tablets, and Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp, TikTok, Twitter, etc. But I think what we kind of need next is for this understanding to be widened and to account for the diversity of technologies to be featured, such as emerging tech like IoT and AI, drones, and that kind of thing. And I think we're just not there yet. And that's sort of really the big step that needs to be taken into account.
Now, of course, within your specific research project within the GIoT project, you focus specifically on the applicability of the Computer Misuse Act 1990 in relation to tech abuse. Now, as I said, I would come back to this at a later stage. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the main findings that you have derived from this research project?
Sure. Our analysis indicated that there were only 2 cases out of the 94 we looked at, which involved tech abuse and IPV, where the Computer Misuse Act was of relevance. So the court cases that we were looking at go back as far as 1990, because we looked at court cases from kind of when the Computer Misuse Act first came about. It's sort of been looking at how technologies have changed over time. And then we also sort of did a second part to our study where we looked at court cases of around about the last 6 months, which involved any form of domestic abuse. And what this sort of showed was that tech abuse was relatively prevalent in these court cases that we were looking at. But one of our kind of key findings of this project was actually how the forms of tech abuse that we were seeing, the technologies that we use were very commonly mobile phones, computers, emails, Facebook, the kind of quite traditional tech abuse methods. We weren't actually seeing, what we know to be kind of more modern, I guess, if you like types of, whether it's drones or through PlayStations, Xboxes, smart fridges, smart doorbells, these kind of newer kind of some of these IoT devices or technologies. So I think what's really interesting is I think that's firstly something that if we continue to monitor this over time, we'll see more and more of these. But I think also a problem is, and this was definitely a big finding from our research, is these court documents, which we were obviously analysing for the research, for the systematic evaluation, they basically consist of law reports and judgments. So they come from kind of the decisions. So when a judge is making a decision in court, this judgment will be written up. So the details we found in these judgments were relatively vague. So we would often see a lot of information maybe on the physical abuse that was experienced or that kind of thing. But when it came to coercive control or anything like that, there would often be really vague terminology used, such as they would list the type of domestic abuse that was experienced, and then it would sort of be added on the end, like, and coercive control. Or they might say something about hacking into a computer, but then that would be it. So we looked at, actually, for the second part of the study, we looked at 108 court cases involving some mention of domestic abuse. So what's kind of important to explain here, firstly, is when we were doing this search, we were looking at any case in the last 6 months that involved any sort of mentioning of domestic abuse. Now, firstly, just to kind of caveat that the research is these online databases that we use, they only give judgments for the really high court cases. So it's a really small proportion of court cases that we were actually able to access. So basically the magistrate court cases and the Crown Court cases, which is kind of where our lawyer on our team sort of explained that the bulk of the business sort of takes place in those lower courts. You cannot access those documents. They're not kind of formally written up and made publicly available. So the kind of cases that we were only able to look at were the high courts. So whether that was the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, etc. So firstly, we were obviously only able to look at this small number, but a lot of the cases that were coming up were basically predominantly in a civil court. And in a civil court, it's not really about, person A taking person B to court because of someone has domestically abused the other one. There were more cases where it was about where the children should live because of the breakdown of a marriage. And then there would sort of be like, by the by, there was some domestic abuse involved with limited information. Or it would be about someone was denied leave to remain to leave in the UK, and it would be because they had previously been a perpetrator. So that was kind of limiting in the sense that quite a few of the cases were actually not very detailed. So when we really wanted to understand like the nuanced details of what abuse was occurring, sadly sometimes it was just sort of mentioned as like that might have occurred, as opposed to like the kind of details that we were looking for. But the cases that were very detailed, we actually found 19 cases which did detail tech abuse and intimate partner violence. So through these kind of cases, we saw a myriad of types of abuse. But like I said, sadly, either it was that in a lot of cases it was very brief on the information, but then others were quite detailed.
Have you got any examples of such cases?
So there was one case where a car tracker was put on someone's car, which really enabled the perpetrator to stalk his ex-girlfriend, which very sadly led to her murder, which really kind of illustrates the danger of tech abuse and kind of what that can lead to. In this case, it was a woman called Shayna Grice, and very sadly, as I mentioned, it led to kind of the most serious outcome, and she had contacted the police many times, and they didn't take it seriously. There were other examples where the perpetrator, which was predominantly male in these cases, would prevent his wife from having any type of contact with the outside world. So they weren't allowed to access their Facebook, their email, their phone was removed from them. So we saw a big range of technologies, but not yet are we kind of seeing the technologies that, like the IoT devices necessarily represented yet in these court cases. And I think ultimately through these kind of two systematic analysis, and obviously, I could talk about these for a very long time. And there's kind of so many interesting things that we found in these two studies, but obviously I've just given a super brief overview of sort of the method. But I think what our research really showed was that authorized access can be and regularly is a feature of IPV, and that prosecutors should be alert to consider the CMA whenever there is an instance of unauthorized access to technology, and really that this legislation needs to be kind of reconsidered in this realm of tech abuse, and not just cases of potentially hacking within a business or that kind of thing, but IPV cases as well. We also consider that, evaluating the applicability of the CMA for IPV cases and specifically tech abuse cases really has provided us with a better understanding of historic domestic abuse and CMA cases. And what we believe that this does is not only give law enforcement agencies and the CPS a powerful tool to charge tech abusers, but also hopefully to help the research and practitioner community to develop an awareness of the types of digital systems that are being abused, and hopefully to explore the use of existing legislation such as the CMA to deal with the harms that are resulting from the digital systems that exist within our society.
Definitely. And I'm also intrigued to know what some of your future plans are with regard to your research on this topic. But before we actually get to that, we'll get to that in a minute. I'm also curious to hear from you if you could give some concrete action points with regard to actually tackling the issue of tech abuse. Now, I know that you've given some insight into the main findings of your project, of the GIoT project, as we spoke about just before. But if you could summarize some of the concrete action points that you would give, what would they be?
So I think that to kind of summarize the Gender and IoT's kind of recommendations through their research are the fact that domestic violence and cybersecurity practitioners certainly need to work in tandem. I think that, as we've talked about before, these kind of issues need to be tackled through so many different routes and kind of expertise. So it's about kind of bringing that knowledge together for sure. And I think about how support services, need to have the capacity to deal with the threat of IoT facilitated tech abuse, and for it to be understood, how much kind of pressure and they're already under and with the work that they do, and kind of how intense and sensitive it is, and about how providing them with the kind of tools they need to kind of understand this new abuse. I think as well, like we've touched on, that domestic abuse and internet security legislation really needs to be future-proofed, and we need to kind of think about how technology is always changing, and also that the risk of tech abuse must be incorporated into risk assessments and safety planning processes as well. And I think something that we briefly talked about was the fact that we really need more data to be collected to estimate the scale of the problem. And also to monitor these changes over time. And often the media and policymakers, they really want this clear number and clear figures concerning tech abuse. So what technologies are being used and how often is it happening? But until tech abuse is more widely accepted as a form of domestic abuse, and it's sort of being included on questionnaires when victims are taking surveys on the type of abuse they're experiencing, like it's very hard to kind of have that concrete data. And I think as well, sort of specifically in terms of the project that I've been working on since I've been with Gender IoT project and our recent research relating to the Computer Misuse Act, one of our main conclusions has been that unauthorized access, which is certainly kind of a key feature of the Computer Misuse Act, is a regular feature of intimate partner violence. And prosecutors, really need to be alert to consider the Computer Misuse Act when there is an instance of unauthorized access to technology. And the people making those charging decisions in intimate partner violent cases, need to be adequately trained concerning the 5 offences that we see in the Computer Misuse Act, because this sort of is a legislation that tend to be focused on in terms of businesses and hacking, not in kind of IPV situations, but we really need to think about how we can use or alter legislation that we have in tech abuse cases, for sure.
And focusing specifically on your research project, what are the next steps that you'll be taking moving forward?
So we've been fortunate enough to recently have been rewarded some further funding from an external body where we're going to actually be able to continue this project looking at the Computer Misuse Act and relevance in tech abuse for the next year. So we have lots of interesting plans where we want to really kind of delve further into this research. And we're going to do a news media content analysis, and we want to understand how these kind of cases are portrayed in the media and how they're written about. We want to continue this kind of systematic legal evaluation and be able to understand more about how tech abuse is featured in these domestic abuse cases. And also we plan to conduct interviews with barristers and judges that were involved in these cases, because we really want to understand in these types of cases what legislation is chosen when the case is taken to court. How do you decide which legislation the offence falls under, if it could fall under various different ones, and what decision would be made for why or why not this Computer Misuse Act might be used.
Very interesting. And I also think that this definitely indicates that there's still a number of very important and relevant issues that will need to be considered and that will need to get attention. And I'm also very interested to hear a little bit more about your research and findings once you continue with the project. But for now, Francesca, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join me and give us a little bit more of an insight into your project specifically, but also the work of the team at the IoT project at UCL more generally. And I want to wish you the best of luck with everything. Thank you.
Of course, no problem at all. It's been so great to be able to chat with you today and to tell you a little bit more about Gender IoT and the work that we're up to. And just to add as well that the best way to stay in touch and up to date with the team's work is through an amazing newsletter that Leonie puts together every month, which you're probably familiar with yourself. And it's full of all the latest kind of news and information and publications and projects that relate to these topics. So through the UCL website on the Gender and IoT page, you can sign up to this newsletter. And it's sort of your one-stop tour every month of kind of everything related to these topics. So it's really, really good way to kind of keep on top of everything as Leonie kind of does the hard work for everyone and puts it all together in one place. So I really recommend.
Yes, definitely. I'll make sure to add a link to the subscription page for the newsletter. I'll add a link for the for your project page on the UCL website, and also to the webinar that you recently gave, which can be found on YouTube. And I'll do so in the description attached to this episode, and also on the social media of the Law of Tech, and of course also any other relevant links that if you want you can share with me, and I'll make sure to share it with the rest of the community. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Law of Tech podcast. If you want to make sure you keep up to date with the show and never miss out on an episode, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice and follow the Law of Tech on social media. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a rating or review, as it helps others discover the show, and don't forget to share it with your network. For now, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Law of Tech podcast.